Hi there, I'm Eric. Welcome back to Not an Audio Review channel where I don't review audio gear. This is a vacuum tube. Now, I love the sound of vacuum tube amplifiers, and this is the thing you have to understand, especially if you've never heard a tube amp. As I talked about in my CanGem video, I tried a $17,000 solid-state headphone amp, and while it sounded amazing, I felt like I could get a close enough experience from a $300 tube amp that I'd never even consider paying that much for a solid-state amp. This is controversial in some quarters, but to me, there's just no question that in terms of sound quality, tubes just give you much more for your money. But there's a lot of very good reasons why they were almost entirely replaced by transistors once they came along. You can see the tube is just bigger. And this is a small tube. There's tubes much bigger than this. And in fact, transistors can get much smaller than this, even miniaturized into an integrated circuit like this one, which is called an op-amp or an operational amplifier. Tubes are much more fragile. They get a lot hotter, like they can seriously burn you if you're not careful. They're much less power efficient. They can take some time to warm up and sound their best. Depending on the design, they need regular biasing, and while a transistor can effectively last forever, a tube needs to be replaced after a year or so of steady use, depending on the tube and the amplifier. On top of this, most tube amplifiers have to be transformer coupled because of the high output impedance of tubes. And output transformers, this isn't actually an output transformer, this is a power transformer, but same basic concept. Output transformers are basically just hunks of iron wrapped in copper, though some use different metals. And they're heavy and expensive, which is why you can get tube power amps that weigh 100 pounds or more, and that costs many thousands of dollars. In other words, tubes are a pain in the ass. But what if you could get the sound of tubes without all that trouble? What if you could just add tube goodness to your solid state? And for not even that much money? Would that even work? Well, that's what I set out to find out. And on the way, I also think I figured out the mystery in my first video that I talked about at some length in the CanGem video too, of what exactly it is that bothers me about most, but not all, transformer-coupled tube amps that I tried, which doesn't bother me about most output transformerless tube amps that I tried. Hey! Oh no, what is it, Monkey Puppet? Tube amplifiers are objectively worse than solid-state amplifiers. What? They're worse. They have measurably higher distortion. Measurement gear is much more sensitive than your lying ears, and if it measures worse, it is worse. Here, look. You can get an Apple dongle for like $8, and it'll measure better than any of those tube amps, and look how small and convenient it is. Yeah, I don't listen to music with measurement gear. But actually, this brings up a good opportunity to explain exactly why tube amps sound better than solid-state amps. But they don't. Get out of here. Off to the comments section with you and your gaslighting. And once again, if you've enjoyed watching me beat my monkey on camera, please consider leaving a like or subscribing or leaving a comment for the algorithm telling me in great detail how much you enjoyed watching me beat my monkey on camera and how it fills you with a joy that you can barely name, much less comprehend. Or whatever. Before the invention of the vacuum tube, there was no such thing as electronic amplification, only acoustic amplification, like putting a cone in front of your mouth. It's actually funny to me that electronic recording was invented before electronic amplification, so the earliest record players just literally have cones connected to the needles to acoustically amplify the sounds coming off of them. Now, there's no such thing as absolutely perfect amplification, and one of the problems with the vacuum tube is that in the process of amplifying the signal, it adds harmonic distortion. Now, over the years, many innovations were created to eliminate this distortion or minimize it, including things like push-pull operation, ultralinear operation, and so on. And then, along came the transistor, which among other advantages to the vacuum tube, when used within specification, produced radically less harmonic distortion than the vacuum tube. But there were among the consumers of audio gear crazy weirdos who missed that distortion, who felt that it added something warmer or more lifelike to the music. And there were other ways that tubes behaved differently from transistors that made them sound superior. And so tube gear continued to be made though as a much more boutique and enthusiast type of pursuit than they'd been before transistors had come along. So what is harmonic distortion? Well, this is a tuning fork. When I strike it, the times will vibrate at 440 times a second, which produces the note middle A. All notes are just vibrating air, and they follow the same basic mathematical principles. Like if these times vibrated 880 times a second, they would make an A note an octave above middle A. And if they vibrated 220 times a second, it would be an octave lower, and so on. Now, a pure vibrating sound wave in a perfect sine wave sounds like this. However, physical objects generally don't make perfect sine waves. So here, I'm plucking a middle A note, the same note as the tuning fork. The thing is that because of the physical properties of the steel string, it doesn't vibrate in a perfect sine wave. There are extra vibrations. You can actually bring out some of them by laying your finger gently 12 frets higher up and plucking the string. This produces A an octave higher, 880 vibrations a second. But you can see that my finger's not touching the string anymore. This is the open middle A string making the higher note. On a piano, you can actually hold down a key gently so that the hammer doesn't hit the string, but the damper is taken off of it, and then quickly play a whole dominant seventh chord an octave above it, and hear that whole chord vibrating off the lower string.
Listen again. Clear as a bell.
This is simply because even when you hit middle A on the guitar, it's also playing A an octave higher and a bunch of other notes that are harmonically related to the original note based on the physical properties of the string and how it vibrates. And it's these additional harmonics in their various amounts and arrangements, this harmonic distortion, as well as what's called intermodal distortion, as the vibrations of different notes interfere with each other, that gives musical instruments and voices their distinct character, that makes a guitar sound different from a piano, sound different from a saxophone, or whatever. Of course, these are desirable sorts of distortion in music, just as distorting an electric guitar with a fuzz pedal is desirable. And indeed, musicians, engineers, and producers might add all sorts of distortion on a recording to get the sound they're after. A stereo amplifier, though, is, in an ideal world, supposed to merely preserve this recording. A wire with gain! That's all I want! The thing is, Monkey, that not only your amplifier but your speakers are adding some amount of harmonic distortion, and for the same reason the guitar string does, because of the physical properties of the driver. Of course, speakers try to reduce that distortion as much as possible, but this distortion has something to do with why one speaker might sound different than another. And for loudspeakers, the sound waves bouncing around whatever room you're in will change the speed of their vibration and thus add harmonic distortion. This is most obvious with what's called room modes, where the bass waves bounce back and forth, elevating certain frequencies. You can see in these measurements of my Q Acoustic Concept 30 speakers, these big elevations in the bass. These aren't present when the speaker is measured in an anechoic chamber. They're created by my room. I mostly deal with them with EQ, though I also have a couple bass traps in the back of my room, which are basically just big cloth and foam things that absorb some of the bass frequencies and keep them from bouncing back to the listening position. Further, with both loudspeakers and headphones, there's a certain amount of distortion created just by the sound waves vibrating in your body and vibrating around your pinna and ear canal. And these sorts of non-linearities, which has the confusing name head-related transfer function, or HRTF, are different for every single person. No headphone sounds exactly the same on two different heads. Which is all why I get a little impatient with people who insist that the sound coming out must remain true to what the artist intended. You're always already not hearing it as the artist originally heard it, with their ears and in their recording studio or whatever. I mean, often artists try to make sure a song sounds good in a car and talk about an acoustically cursed space to play music. To me then, if you have a tube amp adding harmonic distortion, it's kind of like deciding to move your speakers into a different space, one that sounds a certain way, the same way an orchestra playing a symphony in a recording studio is different than playing it in a concert hall. Indeed, there are already EQ settings on lots of devices to mimic the sound of different spaces, and nobody cries out that these things aren't how the artist intended it. Why do I care if the sound is accurate so long as it's pleasing? Indeed, I've been to heavy metal shows where I found the guitar sounds harsh and unlistenable to me, and I would much rather hear it not the way the artist wants it, but the way I want it. But there's so much more to harmonic distortion and tube amps than that. Clipping is the term for when an amplifier hits its amplification limits and can't amplify anymore. If you put a sine wave through an amp and turn it up to clipping, it'll basically chop off the tops and bottoms of the sine wave. A solid-state amp does what's called hard clipping, where the sine wave goes up and then when it hits the limit, it makes a straight line until it comes down again. Tube amps, on the other hand, clip softly, meaning they essentially round off when they hit the clipping limit. Effectively, this means that the tube amp sounds like it has more power than it does, because the same amount of power can essentially get you a bit more amplitude, and the limit is somewhat disguised to the listener, which is why people talk about tube watts being different than solid-state watts in terms of power. But critically, as amplifiers approach clipping, they also produce more harmonic distortion. And tube aficionados will wax poetic about how the soft clipping of tubes produces more pleasing even-order harmonic distortion, while the hard clipping of transistors produces the more harsh-sounding odd-order harmonic distortion. Though both produce both kinds of distortion in some amount, and a lot of modern solid-state amps produce distortion in such low amounts it's highly debatable that you can hear any of it. And I'm going to try and keep this basic, but even-order harmonic distortion is mostly just octaves, which are just the same note in a higher register, or fifths, which are naturally consonant notes that are commonly found in chords in Western music. Odd-order harmonics, on the other hand, are thirds and sevenths, which make up more bluesy and jazzy-sounding chords, a little less consonant. Of course, in music, thirds and sevenths are great, but when you layer them on music that's trying to make other chords and other harmonies, it can sound a bit harsh and jarring. You can actually see this in hard rock and metal music, where guitarists will play power chords, which are only octaves and fifths, because the high distortion they're adding to their guitar makes the thirds and sevenths they might otherwise play sound too discordant and muddy. Tetrode and pentode tubes seem to produce more third-order harmonic distortion than triode tubes as well, though less distortion overall, but I'll talk about that more in a bit. There's one more ingredient to count for, and that's distortion phase. Look, I had to do a lot of research for this video, and now you get to suffer too. Okay, so distortion can be either in phase, positive, with the original music, meaning the distortion follows the waveform of the original signal, or out of phase, negative with the original music, meaning it's reversed. It can actually also be in between those two, but let's not worry about that right now. Depending on the design of the tube amplifier, the distortion may be positive phase or negative phase. And supposedly, positive phase distortion seems to sound closer and more in your face, while negative phase distortion sounds deeper and more localized. And sometimes apparently the phase can kind of shift around a bit with the tube, helping to create that holographic effect, or something like that. Listen, I barely understand this stuff, so it's possible I'm getting things wrong. And if you think I'm getting things wrong, feel free to straighten me out in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Okay, you got all that? Well, if you don't, it's too bad because we're barreling forward anyway. This is a clone of the Musical Fidelity X10-D tube buffer. This goes right in here. Boop-a-doop. The original X10-D was introduced in the 1990s when DACs still weren't very good, as a way of making them sound more natural and organic, especially people who were used to vinyl recordings and maybe a little shocked at how crisp and hard-edged CDs sounded by comparison. This was a very popular unit in its time, and you can find used versions of it that maybe need some capacitor swapping, but even more easily you can find circuit boards for it so you can build your own, which is what I did. The real X10-D retailed for $200 back in the 1990s, or about $400 today. This one cost me about $75 in parts, not including the tubes or the cost of solder and tools. Musical Fidelity also has a new version of this buffer called the X-Tube with some additional features that retails for $500. Now, I've never heard the original X10-D, so I have no idea how this actually compares to it. And as with the amp camp preamp plus headphone amp in my last video, it's entirely possible I messed something up making it because I barely know what I'm doing. And obviously I can't tell at all how it compares to the new X-Tube device. The X10-D uses ECC88 tubes, and these are JJ brand versions of those, which is kind of my baseline for a good quality new production tube that doesn't cost a huge amount of money. Though a pair of these still cost $85, which is more than the cost of the whole rest of the device, but it's still a lot cheaper than the fancy NOS tubes you can find. Also, if you're curious, the X10-D is capacitor coupled like my TA84 tube amp. There's no transformer coupling going on here. And I use pretty good parts, but the case is the cheapest damn thing you can find from Hammond, which is actually a bonus because it's very thin aluminum and was super easy to drill through. Quality. Also may have this top for it. Put some ventilation there. That's nice, right? Yeah, it's actually really hard to make these little slots with a Dremel and make them even, but I did my best. Anyway, I admit it's sad that I don't get the frankly dope-looking cylinder design of the real thing, but unlike the real one, this one has a power switch on the front because I'm not a crazy person, and it's my patented, not actually patented, satisfying old-school flippy switch. It's also got the RGB light with the resistor, so it comes out purple, which I have and you don't, probably. Now, this is just a buffer. It has zero gain, or at least zero voltage gain, but I'm not going to talk about the difference between voltage gain and current gain because I've already bored you enough. We'll just say it has zero gain, okay? You put a signal in here, and you basically get a signal of the same amplitude out the other side. So this takes a 12-volt power supply, though annoyingly it's 12-volt AC, so I couldn't use a conventional DC power supply, even though I have a nice iFi power one. So I got this Jamico linear one for $11. So altogether, the whole project cost me $171, about. Now, if you know anything about tube amp design, you'll say 12 volts for a tube device. That's hardly anything. You see, while transistor-based devices usually use relatively small voltages, like the 24 volts of my ACP+, tube amplifiers usually need much, much higher voltages. Like while a transistor power supply usually steps down the 120 volts coming out of my wall, a tube power supply might step it up instead to 300, 400, 500 volts or more. This also makes building or repairing tube gear usually fantastically dangerous because those kind of voltages, particularly if they pass through your body and hit your heart, will kill you dead real fast. However, this isn't an amplifier, it's a buffer, which means it doesn't have to get the tube running at full gallop, just pass along the input signal with a little bit of tube flavor added to it. The X10-D apparently does have a voltage multiplier on board that increases the voltage to 34 volts before it hits the tube, but that's all it needs to do its thing here. Which also means it's a lot safer to work with than a regular tube amplifier. Getting hit with 34 volts isn't fun, but you'll probably live. And another benefit of running the tubes with so low a voltage is that the tubes run much cooler and last much longer. Like these tubes can last hundreds of hours or more without needing to be replaced. And they're so cool, they can be put up against these film capacitors on the board without any risk to them. Like it's well below their heat tolerance. And unlike a tube amplifier, this buffer doesn't need an output transformer, as I said. The signal gets passed to the solid-state amplifier, which has a much lower output impedance. In effect, this buffer turns any solid-state amplifier into a hybrid amplifier with tube and solid-state stages. Though not all hybrid amplifiers work this way, lots of them do use the tube for actual amplification as a proper input stage or whatever, but that's all outside the scope of this video. Let's look at the distortion measurements for the X10-D. This I made using my audio interface in a free program called REW. Now you can see, compared to the output without the X10-D, the harmonic distortion is higher, with the second order harmonic clearly higher than the rest, as we might expect from triode tubes like these. But keep in mind that decibels are a logarithmic scale, not a linear one. So 3 decibels higher is twice as loud, and 3 decibels lower is half as loud. So at around 79 decibels below the fundamental, or 0.011% of it, the distortion is actually very low. When this was introduced, Musical Fidelity boasted about how low the distortion was, which is a funny thing to brag about with something designed specifically to add distortion. But the point is that it's not adding a huge amount of distortion. It's not coloring your music so much as tweaking it a little bit. That's the pitch anyway. So you can get something of the tone of a high quality, low distortion tube amp without the weight and size and tube replacement and all the rest of it. Oh, come on. What's wrong now, monkey puppet? It's 79 dB below the fundamental. There's no way you can hear that. Look at this chart. 80 dB is about the sound level of heavy traffic or a noisy restaurant and above the level of a vacuum cleaner, which means if you turn your stereo up to that sound level, distortion that's at 80 dB below is non-existent. And then if you turn your stereo louder than that, and you really shouldn't be listening at more than 85 dB or you can damage your hearing, then this distortion is still below the sound level of rustling leaves underneath the sound of your music. I don't think it's that simple. Charts don't lie, Eric. Of course they do. But first off, even if you have your stereo only turned up to 85 dB, that's an average volume and dynamics will get louder than that, which is fine and normal. Also, you can see in the graphs, the distortion goes up at different frequencies, getting as high as 75 dB. And as I said, 3 dB higher is twice as loud, so that's a meaningful difference. But I also think that the capacitors and other components change the sound a little bit in ways that maybe aren't easy to measure. But I'm going to talk about that more in a bit. Like, human ears are really sensitive. And I said the effect here is subtle. Surely you can't be serious. Of course I'm serious, and don't call me Shirley. Prove it in a blind test, Joker. I have a whole other video about why I don't think that's a great way to evaluate how things sound. I know! It's so annoying! You're so annoying! Okay, fine, whatever. But tube amplifiers are bad enough. This doesn't even amplify anything. Actually, technically it does current amplification, which, you know what I mean! Even if you can't hear something, all you're doing is taking your nice clean audio signal and throwing a bunch of dirt on it. You're adding distortion. Distortion. Definitional nonlinearity. But if it sounds good, who cares? Now, get back to the comment section. Come on. Anyway, so just to make the monkey even more upset, I also built one of these. Let's get away. This is an H2 harmonic generator. So old Papa Nelson Pass, the famed amplifier designer behind Pass Labs and First Watt, is a guy who likes some harmonic distortion. Specifically, he likes that pleasing second-order harmonic distortion, but he also, paradoxically, likes making solid-state gear rather than tube gear. So he made this circuit board you can buy that comes with a couple transistors in a little plastic bag with a number on it. What is this mysterious number handwritten on the bag? Well, transistors need a certain amount of bias current to function properly. However, if you put just the right, or maybe wrong, amount of bias current into the transistor, you can make it behave in a nonlinear fashion, which is to say, you can make it produce harmonic distortion. Now, transistors are made with certain tolerances. They don't all come out working exactly the same. And to get just the right amount of harmonic distortion with this particular matched pair of transistors, that's these little black guys right here, you have to set the bias to the magic number on the baggie. And if you do that, you should get approximately 1% harmonic distortion. I, however, got something like twice that, but I determined that it seemed to be because the H2 is very sensitive to signal voltage. And while some DACs output a 2-volt signal, mine outputs a 4-volt signal. I confirmed first with the Modi Plus, which has a 2-volt signal, and then simply by turning down my D2R DAC using the digital preamp functionality, that if I reduced it to about 2 volts, I would get approximately the right amount of distortion. And as you can see, the H2 produces a lot more distortion than the X10-D with actual tubes in it, which is kind of funny, but not surprising for something that calls itself a harmonic generator. Now, the H2, as designed, produces positive phase distortion. However, on a speaker system, you can flip the phase by switching the speaker terminals so that the red cable goes in the white terminal and the white in the red terminal for each speaker. And that way you can try out negative phase distortion on the H2. I'm not actually sure what the phase distortion is like on the X10-D. I don't know if it's negative phase or if it's changing. It does sound wider rather than more in your face, but REW doesn't seem to tell you that. Now, the H2, using the default recommended components, does add a bit of voltage gain. But by getting a few different resistors, you can easily make the device unity voltage gain, just like the X10-D, which is exactly what I did. All in all, the parts and chassis for my H2 cost about $70, including some upgraded capacitors I got. Man, look at this. Drilling consistently spaced holes in a chassis is actually surprisingly difficult. I got some advice from a friend online after doing this, which is why the X10-D looks slightly better. But yeah, chassis are such a pain in the tuchus. This is also why I didn't bother putting a power switch or an LED on the H2. The circuit board doesn't have slots for them to connect to, but you could do it with point-to-point wiring pretty easily, but I couldn't be bothered. You plug it in, it's on. You unplug it, it's off. Done. Looks like this once it's all screwed together. Yeah. Anyway. The H2, like the X10-D, takes a 12-volt power supply, but it uses a proper DC supply, so I could use my iPower one with it. So my H2 has a nicer power supply than my X10-D, for whatever that's worth. I'm still annoyed I can't use the same supply for both of them like I intended. So, here we have two devices that promise to give you something of the glory of a tube amp without actually having the pain in the tuchus of an actual tube amp. And there's one more ingredient I want to bring into the mix. You might be aware that tube amps aren't only popular for audiophile weirdos. There's another group of weirdos that still uses tube amplification. In fact, a much, much larger group of weirdos, which is electric guitar players, who praise tubes for the special guitar tone they can get from pushing the preamp sections near clipping. But as I mentioned, tubes are fucking annoying, so guitarists in the age of computers have increasingly turned to tube simulators, which is to say digital gear with software that emulates the behavior of tubes. And over the last couple decades, these simulators have gotten really good. It's incredibly annoying to me that while tube simulation for guitar amps has gotten extremely sophisticated, for stereo it's basically still in the dark ages. Like my SMSL VMV D2R DAC has filters that are supposed to be tube-like, but I tell you honestly, I cannot hear the difference between these things being on or off at all, not even a little. I can though hear the difference between the slow oversampling filter and the fast oversampling filter. The slow oversampling filter sounds like shit. The Ferrum Wandla Golden Sound Edition DAC also has a tube mode, and while I can hear a difference there, it's very subtle and doesn't have any of the kind of configuration options that you find on guitar sims. Like, this really seems like a missed opportunity with all the future-fi digital gear coming out now. Like, why isn't there more tube simulation? Especially since the bulk of the work has already been done for the guitar sim market. This seems like a market opportunity waiting to be tapped. Somebody out there make a device or a DAC or something that can do real tube simulation. Maybe with options for different tubes and different modes of operation and so on. Like, come on, you could sell it as 100 tube amps in a box. Anyway, I don't have that. But what I do have is a tube simulator plugin from WaveArts called Tube Saturator Vintage, which imitates a dual 12 AX7 tube preamp. Now this is designed for guitarists, but this drive knob is what brings the amp up close to clipping and generates the distortion. So as long as you keep that very low, you can get something approaching what you'd expect from a proper tube buffer. Now this is a VST plugin, which can be used by a variety of different software products. In this case, I'm playing music off my Mac, and I'm using a program called Sound Source, which costs $55 and also gives me full parametric EQ and some other goodies. But you might be able to find something that can run VST plugins for free. And the Tube Saturator plugin is free, though you have to register with WaveArts, which will put you on their mailing list, which is annoying. But like, a small price to pay compared to all this other shit. Another plugin I want to talk about briefly is the M-Poly Saturator plugin from Melda Productions. Now, where the Tube Saturator Vintage emulates tubes, the M-Poly Saturator is much more like the H2 in that it just produces harmonic distortion. But unlike the H2, this plugin lets you dial in as much or as little distortion as you want, whatever order of harmonic distortion that you want. Cool, right? This plugin isn't free, but it has a free trial, after which it costs $57. I also have the Stimulate plugin from Viator DSP that lets you create harmonic distortion. And this is the only one I found that also lets you flip the phase. The problem with it is that as a plugin for guitarists, it's specifically designed to enhance treble, and so doesn't do anything for the frequencies under 1 kilohertz, which is much less useful for my purposes, but fun to play with. And it's free, so that's nice. Aren't plugins fun? There's probably a lot more out there that I didn't find, and if you know of any, please let me know in the comments. But enough foreplay, huh? Grouse. Ow, 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 ow. How do these things sound? As you might know from my previous videos, my default solid-state headphone amp preamp is the Aoun S17 Pro. Now, this amp has been described as having a tubey sound to begin with. The thing is, of course, if you've been paying attention to everything I already said, there isn't really one tube sound. Different tubes and amps have different distortion and behavior profiles and can sound very different. But what people mean when they say the S17 Pro sounds tubey is that it's a bit rich and warm and on the full side of neutral, and I think that's true, and that has a lot to do with why I like it. But it makes pairing it with these devices more of a mixed bag because it kind of has its own flavor. But while I was trying all this out, I happened to get something else. So this is the Ferrum ore. Now, I'm going to give this thing its own video, but it's much more neutral and clean sounding than the S17 Pro and has lower distortion, though the S17 Pro has incredibly low distortion already. So it makes for a better platform just to evaluate these devices, though I'll also be talking about how they sound with the S17 Pro. To start with, the X10-D clone. I kind of feel like this thing does what it says it does. It doesn't add a lot of warmth or fullness to the sound, but it definitely rounds off the edges a little bit and softens them up. Makes it sound a bit more organic and natural and maybe deep. If you're looking for something that'll make your gear sound really bloomy and fat, this ain't it. But it did make a nice complement to the ore, making it sound less harsh. Particularly if you have a system that's maybe a little harsh or sharp, this might be a nice complement or a nice tone you can throw on it for particular kinds of music if you want. Of course, it's single-ended, which is fine if you're really into balanced gear. This isn't that either. But balanced tube gear tends to be a lot more expensive because you have to double the signal stages. Somebody who's a better engineer than me might be able to figure out how to take two of these circuit boards and make a balanced version, but that's not something I know how to do. And the thing is, while this complements the ore, it sounds nice on the S17 Pro, but the effect is more subtle because that's already a non-sharp headphone amp. And it's the kind of thing where I might not even notice it's on. But also, one of the things I like about tube amps is the holographic effect you get, how things seem more three-dimensional. And when you get a bit of that on the X10-D, and especially start to hear it after long listening, the effect is just very subtle, especially compared to an actual tube amp like my TA84. Now, the H2. This thing is much less subtle than the X10-D, as you might expect from the distortion measurements I showed earlier. The sound is noticeably richer and fuller, and once again, this seems to help out the ore better than the S17 Pro. Where the S17 Pro, it's like putting fudge on chocolate mousse. It can maybe get a bit much. And my main problem with the H2, I think, is the ways in which it doesn't work like a tube amp. Like the H2 definitely makes it sound more gummy and thick, and when in negative mode, definitely gets a bit more expansive and wider. But I think maybe because the harmonic distortion is more linear, maybe meaning it's a straight line, not like linear reproduction. And because it doesn't vary as much with dynamics the way actual tube gear does or something, it doesn't quite get that added organic naturalness or sense of holography. And let me know in the comments what you think. Maybe there's more going on than simple harmonic distortion that makes tubes sound like tubes. Before I'd finished the H2 and tried it, I had this fantasy of maybe building an ultimate H2. You see, on DIYaudio.com, there's examples of how you can modify the circuit to make the second order distortion adjustable with a knob. You can also put another knob in to adjust the volume, make it a real preamp, but I wanted to also be able to have a switch to flip the phase, and to do that you really need another amplification stage, either a transistor or an op amp, that you wire up in a circuit with a phase inversion that you can flip on and off, and then you're off to the races. You could even stick a headphone jack in there and have a headphone amp preamp. And that would still be a really cool project for someone else. After trying the H2, I just find myself less interested in this way of generating harmonic distortion, especially as I played with the plugins on my computer. Now the thing is, turning up the second harmonic distortion in the M-Polysaturator plugin to approximately the same level as the H2 does sound a lot like the H2, but it doesn't sound exactly like the H2. And I think that might have something to do with the capacitors and other components of the device changing the sound in ways that don't necessarily show up in simple distortion measurements. I know the capacitors affect the sound because this came with electrolytic capacitors in the signal path, as I mentioned earlier. And much as I did with the ACP Plus, I swapped the smaller capacitance capacitors with film caps and put bypass caps underneath the larger capacitance electrolytics, which gives you a bit of film cap flavor without the expense and size of a high capacitance film cap. And that clearly, in my judgment, improved and cleared up the sound. Which is why I think that there's something beyond simply measurable harmonic distortion affecting the sound with these devices. Because if you just add harmonic distortion with a plugin, you don't get quite the same sound. And further, at lower levels of distortion like the X10-D has, I think with the plugins, it's much harder to hear any difference at all. But this does mean that one of the advantages of the plugins is that you don't need to worry about all this capacitor neuroses or other things like the power supply or whatever. Though on the other hand, there's people who fiend over the sound of particular capacitors, so that might also be a downside. Speaking of capacitors, I started playing with the plugins and turning the harmonics up and down at different frequencies, and I noticed something startling. So back in my first episode, I said that the transformer coupled tube amps I tried had what I called a crispy thickness that I didn't like, which is a terrible way to describe something, but describing how something sounds is hard, okay? But this is the thing. When I went into the harmonic distortion plugin and just cranked up the third order harmonic distortion, that was the sound. The music suddenly had the crispy thickness thing that I was talking about. This was it. I was hearing odd order harmonic distortion. I'm sure of it. So do transformer coupled tube amps necessarily have more odd order harmonic distortion than capacitor coupled ones? No. But I found a couple transformer coupled tube amps that didn't have the sound of CanJam, the Felix Envy and the Manley Absolute. However, it does have more odd order harmonic distortion? Tetrode and pentode tubes as opposed to triode tubes. Now, I don't want to get too far into how vacuum tubes work. There's other videos that talk about that. But basically, the triode is the original kind of amplification vacuum tube. It has three parts, which is why it's called a triode from the Greek three. A cathode that emits electrons, the anode or plate that collects the electrons, and the grid, which modulates the signal so that what arrives at the anode is a version of the signal on the plate, but with greater amplitude. Now, in order to solve some efficiencies of the triode, at some point the tetrode was invented, which adds another grid called a screen to the tube. And in order to solve some of the inefficiencies of the tetrode, the pentode was invented, which adds yet another grid called a suppressor. But while tetrodes and pentodes have some advantages over the triode, particularly they have a lot more gain, meaning they can make a lot more amplitude, they also tend to create a lot more odd order harmonic distortion. Actually, I'm going to quote Terry from La Dolce Audio, makers of fine tube amplifiers, who's forgotten more about vacuum tubes than I'll ever know. Terry says, a leaner sounding pentode, which is a field effect device like a MOSFET or a JFET, has a lot of gain. This gain comes with a healthy dose of third order harmonic distortion, which most of the time is out of phase with the signal. This produces a sharp top to the sine wave, but they are often out of sync with the other half of the signal, so this increases the second order harmonic distortion. In the end, we perceive this as finer edges to the sound, and in mild amount gives more micro detail without harshness and greater macro dynamics on the tube output compared to its input. I think this finer edged odd order distortion is what I was hearing with most of these tube amps. Like the LSA VT70 I had ran pentode tubes. But if you watched my first video, you might say the ZMF pendant I had ran exactly the same tubes as my X-Duo TA84. But the pendant had the sound I didn't like, and the TA84 doesn't. But here's the thing. You can run a tetrode or a pentode as a triode. You just turn off those extra grids, and presto, it's a triode. A lot of amps that run pentodes and tetrodes actually let you switch them into triode mode to get a different sound flavor. And I'm pretty sure the pendant was running the EL84 tubes as pentodes, while the T84 is running them as triodes. Meanwhile, the Felix Envy, which I like the best, is triodes through and through, and the Manley Absolute, according to its website, it's operating that EL90 beam tetrode as a triode as well. The only real wrinkle in this theory is the DNA supernon, which like the Manley uses beam tetrodes in triode mode. But I could swear I heard this phenomenon when I tried it at CanJam. Either I was mistaken, which was possible, CanJam is not a great place to do discerning listening, or the device is doing something else to generate that extra third order harmonic distortion or something This would all be a lot easier, actually, if all these amplifier companies posted detailed harmonic distortion measurements for their devices, but most of the time all we get is a total THD number, which is just not really useful for my purposes. Anyway, this is overall an amazing discovery. It's not the transformer coupling that was the problem, it was the tetrodes and pentodes. This opens up new things to me, maybe possibly I'll be exploring in future episodes. Back to our plugins. The Poly M saturator was interesting, but it was the tube saturator vintage that I really liked. I mean, this thing really does sound like tubes to me, at least some kind of tubes, and it's designed to imitate 12AX7s, which are triodes. Much like the X10-D, this really took the edges off the ferrum ore and even gives that little bit of improvement to the S17 Pro. Does it give either of them the full tube qualities of my TA84? Well, no. Like, I can still plug into the TA84 and it just has this space and organicness that the solid state amps lack for all the other fine qualities. But this is a noticeable improvement to my taste to my solid state gear, and it's free. I should mention that I have no affiliation at all with WaveArts who make this plugin. They have no idea I'm making this video or that I exist. But if you're at all curious about this stuff and stream audio off a computer or something that can run a VST plugin, just get this. It's great. Honestly, if WaveArts made a more advanced version of this that imitated different kinds of tubes and topologies and so on, and it didn't cost a fortune, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. This is the kind of thing you can do with digital that makes it really compelling. So, with all this labor, was I successful in making my solid state amps sound as good as a tube amp? Well, not really. At least not as good as my tube amp. I think if you want some tube flavor in your life, building or buying an X10-D is fun and it does what it promises, but getting a plugin is almost as good. Better in some ways because it's adjustable and free. And the H2 is mostly an interesting curiosity, but not something I'd leave in my system personally. I'm still exploring though, maybe I'll come up with something better. Meanwhile, so I bought the ferrum ore. Some people have said this amp is boring, but after trying it at CanJam, I thought it sounded great. But CanJam is a terrible place to listen to things, and I've thought things sounded great there before and brought them home and not liked them. So, how does the ore stack up? Can it finally dethrone my S17 Pro? Maybe if I add some of this tube flavor to it to even the odds? Well, tune in next time for an answer to that question and more. Meanwhile, like, subscribe, comment, eat something tasty. You deserve that in your life. And I'll see you next time.